Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Rebecca, and I am with Monthly Review Press. Today, with John Bellamy Foster, I'm pleased to be with Erald Kolasi and his guest Blair Fix, ready to discuss the themes and questions that arise in Erald Kolasi's new book, The Physics of Capitalism. All economic activities depend on energy flows, and none of those activities can exist separately from the laws of physics. The conversion of energy into different forms is actually what makes civilization possible. The dominant narrative is the idea, he says, that humanity can overcome the ecological problems of late-stage capitalism through technological innovation. But in his book, The Physics of Capitalism, he explains that technological innovation has actually produced more energy-intensive societies, and improving energy efficiency tends to lead towards more energy use over time, not less. So instead of advocating for technological change, he says, as the solution to these problems, we should advocate for social and political transformation. We should change how power is wielded in society, how decisions are made, how labor is organized, how wealth is distributed. Revolutionary transformation is what we need to secure our future. So these are all quotes from The Physics of Capitalism, and that is what this conversation will be about. I would like to hand over the conversation to Erald himself, and he'll go into all the things I just described in his own words.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that introduction. Thank you, Blair and John, for being here. Look forward to a great discussion. So let me begin just with an introduction, a 5 to 10 minute introduction on some of the main themes and ideas of the book, right? So what is this book about? What am I trying to achieve? All of that. So at a very high level, the book is about the complex relationship between the natural world and human society. In the book, I describe human society and the natural world as an integrated system with dynamic feedback loops, right? Meaning that changes in society precipitate changes in nature, and then changes in nature precipitate changes in society. And the reason why I think it's important to emphasize this is because I want to get away from the view that human society is active and the natural world is somehow passive. In other words, we do things and nature just sort of sits there. And although it's true that we might think that we have dominance or we've conquered certain biophysical systems, for example, we slaughter billions of animals every single year. Nevertheless, it's also true that bacteria and viruses kill millions of people every single year. So I wanted us to get away from this idea that nature is something that can be conquered or dominated. Nature is ever present. It's something we interact with. And nature is active. And not just in some abstract sense, but it actively shapes the dominant features, or many of the dominant features of human society, right? And so this basic summary I call the ecodynamic synthesis in the book. It's a long-running theme throughout the book, comes up in the introduction and in many other chapters. All right, so that's sort of at a high level. Now, before I get into some of the main arguments of the book, let me just issue a little bit of a caveat, and this is more relevant for people who may not have read the book yet. Right, so the book is called The Physics of Capitalism, but it's not just about physics and science, right? There's a lot in there about economics and politics and history and culture and even a little bit of philosophy, right? It's an interdisciplinary, comprehensive, multidimensional analysis of our current historical conditions. Now, why is that important? Well, because science can tell you a lot of facts and data about the world. It can tell you, how much sea levels are rising and the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the Clausius-Clapeyron equation can tell you that 1 degree Celsius higher gives you 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that's all great. But if you're going to address the fundamental question of, well, what do we do in response to these ecological challenges, to the political and economic crises that we have, what kind of society should we set up, then you're necessarily implicating the political sphere, the economic sphere, right, the social sphere more broadly. So that is why the book does have this sort of comprehensive look at it. Okay, now let me actually get into some of the more sort of concrete arguments, and I'll state about 4. And this is not an exhaustive list, and we'll get into a lot of the sub-arguments and corollaries in the course of the discussion. So the first major argument that the book makes is that modern civilization is too energy intensive and inefficient. And as a result, it is undermining the ecological basis that's necessary for the survival of civilization, right? So what does that mean? It means we consume a lot of energy from the natural world. We convert a lot of that energy into useful forms, electricity, mechanical work, controlled radiation. But we dump the vast majority of that energy back into the natural world in highly useless and degraded forms, right? And we are overwhelming the capacity of a lot of natural sinks to absorb this energy. And so what's happening is we're injecting a lot of chaos and instability into the biosphere. And like I said, if this process continues, and what does that mean if this process continues? It means if global energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and resource consumption continue to rise at about 0.5 percentage point to 1% every year for the next century, it is almost certainly the case, it's almost guaranteed that global civilization will have a major collapse within the next 200 or 300 years. I think it's almost unavoidable. So the point is, we cannot go in that direction, right? So that's one of the major arguments of the book. Like, this is, at a high level, the big threat we face. And again, we'll talk about some of the specific issues that arise in that over the course of the discussion. Okay, next is about technological innovation, right? So one of the major arguments that is made about our present moment is that human beings are ingenious, right? We can solve everything. Technological innovation can overcome any problem. It doesn't matter how much resources we use or what we're pumping into the atmosphere. We can always do solar radiation management. We can always do carbon capture and storage and pull out the carbon dioxide, and then we'll be fine, right? So there is this popular viewpoint out there that technological innovation can overcome any material and ecological crisis that we have, right? And one of the main arguments I make in the book is that technological innovation, once we properly understand what we're talking about, actually tends to expand the energy scale of our economic systems, and therefore tends to impose even greater burdens on the stability of the biosphere, right? So that is one of the major arguments in the book, that technological innovation is not going to get the job done. We also need to have social and political transformation if we're going to deal with a lot of our fundamental problems. That doesn't mean you can't have technological innovation. It just means it can't be the primary strategy, right? The primary strategy needs to be social and political transformation and economic transformation, like I said in the book, and as Rebecca quoted, who wields power, how wealth is distributed, how is industrial manufacturing organized, what do our political systems look like, all of those things, right? That's where the fundamental level of analysis needs to be. And then technological innovation is something that can supplement that, right? But it can't be the only solution. Okay, so that's another one of the major arguments in the book. A third argument is that we need to transition away. So this is more now getting at a solution. We need to transition away from an economic regime based on growth to an economic regime based on stability. And I even give this viewpoint a name. I call it veilerism. So I described that in the book. So from growth to stability, from capitalism to veilerism, what does stability mean? It means having managed it means several things, right? And again, we'll get into more details later, but it means having managed fluctuations in energy use and resource consumption around a dynamic equilibrium. So that could look like a lot of different things, but in the book, I basically recommend sort of like a dynamic range with a maximum cap, and allowing resource use and energy use to fluctuate around that. So that's one thing it means. It means having healthy ecological footprints and land use dynamics. So land use dynamics is something I talk about extensively in the book because a lot of the reason why we use so much energy, a lot of the reason why we dump so much waste, trash, and pollution into the biosphere is because we have very, in many cases, very ridiculous and poorly thought out land use dynamics. Okay, so these are some of the major arguments that I make as to in what kind of direction we need to go in, right? Okay. And then a fourth argument, and again, so this is something that kind of underpins all of these arguments. So a fourth argument is that to properly understand um, the situation we're in and the policy recommendations that we need to make, we can't view economics just as a kind of in a sort of financial sense, right? So financial aggregates like GDP and consumer spending and things like that, they're not useful indicators of aggregate scale. And they're highly arbitrary, and they can be easily made to say whatever you want them to say just by switching a few statistical parameters. So the best way to understand what our economies are doing is to look at them as thermodynamic systems, right? And to look at their system dynamics, to look at how they're using energy, right? Where they're deploying it, where they're dumping it, to look at all of these dynamics, because these ultimately are the paths that are going to get us to better solutions than what we have now, right? So there's a lot of what I write in the book is in contrast to a lot of what's written in ecological economics, where people try to put financial valuations, on ecosystem services. Those are people like Robert Costanza and all of those kinds of people. There's a lot of work out there trying to, use energy-based and biophysical dynamics to explain GDP. Well, I don't think GDP is something that needs to be explained because it's not an accurate barometer of biophysical scale or real output or anything like that. So this is what I explained in chapter 1. And so this is how, a lot of the theoretical underpinnings of my work are also different from what's out there in ecological economics. I want to understand the biophysical dynamics, especially of capitalism, and especially the biophysical dynamics of technological change in capitalism. So this is a major theme in the later chapters of the book, where I introduce what I think is a major new concept called spectralization, which is about the changes in conversional technologies. And that's something that I hope we'll talk about later, right? So that's another kind of like major background argument in the book, that the best way to understand what our economies are doing, what kind of effects they're having on the natural world, how that could reverberate back on us, all these things, right? The best way to do that is to have this kind of energy-based and biophysical analysis. Financial aggregates are useful for different things. They're useful for understanding the social and class dynamics of capitalism. So in that sense, they're very useful to understand why capitalists are doing certain things. But then if you want to understand our place within the biosphere and where it's going, and what we need to do so we have long-run compatibility with a wider planetary ecosphere, then financial aggregates are useless for that. So those are some of the major arguments in the book. And like I said, that's not an exhaustive list. And there's a lot that we can go through in each one of those. So Blair and John, let me turn it over to you, see if you have any follow-up thoughts to that.
I will, I'll just start with the fourth point. I mean, I actually think that the physics of capitalism puts more together in terms of the ecological problem as a whole and what we need to do about it than any other single source I could point to. I regret I'm teaching environmental sociology right now, and I regret that it wasn't on the syllabus because it was just published. But next year when I teach the course, this book is going to be at the center of it. And I think that all of the points that Erald makes in the book are extremely important. These 4 points. I wanted to raise some questions about what I understand is the fourth point that you just presented, which has to do with how we view how we view economics in contrast to some of the things that are coming out in ecological economics, not in the more radical versions of ecological economics, but in sort of the neoclassical environmental economics, which has become so dominant. And I guess part of it is I'm thinking about your use of the term bionomics. And it's very interesting to me because, I mean, you're talking about the bionomic disturbance as a way of referring to ecological crisis, which I like in a lot of ways. It's very interesting to me that, when Ernst Haeckel introduced the concept of ecology in 1866, but it didn't really catch on. And Marx's friend Lancaster, Ray Lancaster, who was a protege of Darwin and Huxley, and the leading biologist of his day, and really a major environmental thinker. The word ecology first came into English in the translation from Haeckel that he supervised, but Lancaster himself in 1888 introduced the term bionomics. And it was meant to capture what Darwin had talked about, the economy of nature. So what he wanted to look at the interdependence of nature and the flows within nature. And ecology, as Haeckel had presented it, didn't do that. It was something quite different. It was more like a survival of the fittest notion. And so Lancaster introduced bionomics. So I've been interested in that, as an approach to ecology. We talk about ecological crisis, but in a way you're referring to a bionomic disturbance or bionomic crisis, which interests me because, well, bionomics is now used sometimes as, in an ecological sense, as just a synonym for ecology. It was closer to Lancaster's view, but now it's also used as in an economic sense, where they interpret ecology in kind of in terms of mainstream economics. So it's a word that's somewhat ambiguous. But I thought that the way you were using it, which interests me, was more as a way of instead of talking about ecological crisis, we talk about bionomic disturbance to indicate that this involves both the economy and the ecology. That is a kind of a combined contradiction. You don't really tease that out, but it's very important in my perspective because we want to understand how the crisis is both economic and ecological. We call it an ecological crisis, but it stems from the nature of the economy. So that is one thing that really struck me in your book. It may seem like a secondary matter, but for me, it's actually really important in conceptualizing it. I have about 3 other issues I'd like to raise and that we could talk about, and maybe I'll get to raise some of them, but I wanted to put that one before you first.
Thank you, John. Yeah, and so in the book, I call it the bionomic disruption. 2 major elements that I'm trying to get there, as I said in the introduction as well, is when you view humanity and nature as this integrated system, the problems that we're having necessarily transcend all of these scales, right? And that's what the term bionomic disruption is supposed to get at, that there's an ecological crisis in nature, but that's not somehow abstracted from humanity, right? And it doesn't affect us at all. No, it will affect us because we are an integrated system, and if the natural world and the biosphere deteriorates to a severe extent, then global civilization is going to collapse. And I want to pause here and just give some more context from what I'm talking about, because often when I hear people talking, for example, about global warming or climate change, and I want to emphasize my book is a lot more than just about that, right? Global warming and climate change, they feature prominently, and in some sense they're our biggest long-term threat. But the book is about many other ecological crises as well. But if you talk about, the climate, which is obviously one of the major drivers of the biosphere and of human history in general, there's what I call conventional threats and apocalyptic threats, right? And they're not often well distinguished. So the conventional threats are things like, well, temperatures are a lot higher, so construction workers can't do their job. Some are dying, heat waves, things like that, right? Or it is, amplifying a lot of biophysical phenomena like droughts, floods, right? You make it hotter. There's a lot more moisture in the air. So hurricanes are now dumping a lot of, water, dumping a lot of rain. Look at what happened in Western North Carolina very tragically a couple of months ago, in Florida. So there's threats like that, right? There's threats with expanding, viruses, because mosquitoes, they thrive in warmer temperatures, right? Their metabolism goes up, so they're always out on the hunt. And so now you've had an expansion of things like West Nile and Zika, a lot of climate-induced viruses. And then you have things like cholera when you have water runoff and flooding events, and you have wildfires and algae blooms, and I could go on, right? So these are examples of, what I call conventional threats that are serious in the sense that they're putting a lot of pressure on civilization, right? But then there's apocalyptic threats, and these are more associated with what climate scientists call tipping points, right? So these are critical critical thresholds in the biosphere that, if they're crossed, would lead to sudden, major, irreversible changes that could, in many cases, bring down entire countries. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? There are many we could talk about, but I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a current in the Atlantic. It's known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, right? So climate scientists just call it AMOC for short. So I'm just going to call it AMOC instead of having to say Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation all the time. And what this current system does is it transports a lot of warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic, right? And it's called overturning because as it goes up in the Atlantic, when it gets cold in the north, it literally sinks into the ocean, and then it comes back down, and then as it gets hotter, it rises, and it's kind of like a giant conveyor belt. And one of the critical things that this system does is it keeps much of Europe and North America warmer than they otherwise would be. And about 11,000 years ago, it actually collapsed momentarily. It's a period known as the Younger Dryas in geology. And the causes of that collapse are debated. It could have been a major sea in North America that dumped a bunch of fresh water. That changed the salinity, so it destroyed the overturning part of the circulation, and basically it ground to a halt. But when that happened, temperatures in Europe just plunged, at least in much of Northern Europe. That's one system that some climate scientists think is fairly close to, maybe not collapsing, but it's close to being severely destabilized, and maybe within a century it could collapse. If that did happen, you would see, the North Sea freezing over, large parts of Northern Europe becoming almost instantly uninhabitable within a couple of years. Imagine, refugees from Britain going into France. It's their worst nightmare, having to live with the French. So Scandinavia, Denmark, right? A lot of these places, much of Canada would become uninhabitable almost within a couple of years, right? That's an example of a tipping point. That's an example of a critical threshold that, if you cross it, could be very dangerous, right? And so right now what's happening is, because of all the melting ice, there's a lot of fresh water that's being pumped into the Atlantic. That's weakening. It has already severely weakened AMOC. And if we keep weakening it, at some point it's going to collapse. Now, there are a lot of debates about when it's going to collapse. Is it going to collapse 40 years from now? Is it going to collapse 140 years from now? I don't really know, right? Some people think it's going to be sooner rather than later. Some people think we still have about a century or more. In one study that came out recently, it looked at temperature deviations in the North Atlantic, and they're starting to get bigger and bigger from the average. That's often a signal in science of criticality, and you see it in many other cases. So even in the stock market, where you have a lot of volatility and then there's the crash, you see it in condensed matter physics. You see it in just about anything, right? And so some people think that could be a sign that it's getting closer to collapsing, right? And that would be horrible. I mean, that would be like I said, that would be a civilization killer, at least for much of Europe and North America. Another example is the potential collapse of the Amazon. We're used to thinking of the Amazon as the biggest, grandest rainforest in the world, and it is that, but it's also severely under threat from deforestation, but also from global warming, which is causing a lot of wildfires, a lot of droughts. So there's fears that by the end of the century, the Amazon, which has been the greatest rainforest in the world, could look more like a savanna. And if that happens, it would have fundamental impacts on agricultural production in South America, fundamental impacts on hydrological dynamics throughout the Western Hemisphere. So it would cause a lot of droughts and floods and just a lot of chaos. So that's another big one that sort of keeps me up at night. So these are the kinds of things that are more worrying, and that's why I call them apocalyptic threats, right? And these obviously implicate both the ecological realm, the natural world itself, but they instantly implicate a human civilization as well. Because if these critical thresholds are breached, there really isn't much time to do anything, right? At that point, it's too late. And so our goal should be not to breach them. And that is why one of the critical things I have emphasized in the book is this notion of planetary boundaries. So there's a famous paper from 2009 by Johan Rockström and a lot of his colleagues called "A Safe Operating Space for Humanity." It's one of the most famous papers in the history of climate science and the ecological sciences more broadly. So I adopt a lot of that framework. And again, you can always debate what should the planetary boundaries be? Should we have 350 parts per million in carbon dioxide or 380? And some of those debates are useful, I agree, but nevertheless, the broader framework, I think, is very important for civilization. And this is part of the veilerist project as well, that when we monitor our biophysical and ecological dynamics, we need to be monitoring these critical thresholds to make sure that, either we don't cross them or that we don't cross them for too long. It's okay to cross some of them for, 10, 20, 30 years, but we shouldn't cross them for 100 years, right? Otherwise, you're inviting disaster. So let me pause right there.
Well, maybe I can jump in here. Excuse me. Erald, maybe we should go just back right to the title of the book, The Physics of Capitalism. Economics, mainstream economics, is often presented or presents itself as a kind of physics of society, value-free analysis of the economy. What do you think that mainstream economics gets wrong, and what does it completely ignore? Obviously, you're emphasizing the physical side of capitalism, but I'm just interested to hear your kind of big picture thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Blair. And one thing I want to emphasize right off the bat is I wrote this book for a general audience, and so I didn't assume a lot. I didn't assume that I was right about everything or that people would agree with me. And so one of the things I do in the first few chapters is I spend a lot of time attacking what you might call conventional economic theories, right? So in chapter 2, it's sort of a broad-based critique of neoclassical theory in general. It's not even necessarily related to the ecological, or let me put it this way, not even directly related, but it might be tangentially related. And then in chapter 3, I attack neoclassical theories of growth, right? And so in terms of what they get wrong, how many hours are there in the day, right? But one of the, let's start with a concrete example, because that might be good. So in terms of neoclassical theories of growth, right? So let's talk about Robert Solow, right? Robert Solow is a famous economist from the 1950s, Nobel Prize winner, and had a theory that said, well, and there are a lot of theories that are based on his theories that basically said, the economy has a bunch of capital and labor inputs, and then there's some technological change, and these things combined will give you growth, right? And specifically the technological change itself. But his theories is absolutely useless because the equations that he used are essentially no different than identity equations under the empirical conditions that they were tested. And so they don't give you any concrete notion of what an economy is doing. They're just kind of true by definition. And there's a lot of nonsense work like this in economics that is awarded with a Nobel Prize. Take, for example, William Nordhaus. William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for the DICE model, right? The Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy model. So this is a model that purports to show, the impacts of global warming on the economy. And so basically through a simple quadratic function that relates, GDP to temperature changes. And it's a model that's been, widely and ruthlessly criticized because it does not include any function for ecological tipping points in the climate or the biosphere more broadly, like the ones we just talked about, right? So as I write in the book, if you increase global temperatures by like 10 degrees, in the next year, that would mean that humanity goes extinct. The DICE model treats that as just another routine hit to GDP, right? Because it doesn't account for tipping effects, right? So it's a very silly model. There's a lot of other issues with it. So Nordhaus uses an artificially high discount rates, so he can say that the present value of future ecological damages is very low. He has no basis for making that claim, and most people actually disagree with him. They've said that the social cost of carbon is much higher than what he estimates it to be. But at the end of the day, as I write in the book, a lot of these things are just they're just fairy tales that are kind of distractions from what we really need to do, right? The best way to understand what's going on is to look at the biophysical dynamics of their economies and look at the biophysical impacts in the natural world. And Blair, and we could also talk about problems with the notion of substitution. So neoclassical theories of growth, they assume that everything can be substituted, right? If we have a resource scarcity, that's no problem because we can just substitute it with something else, right? We can always grow more efficient. We can always have technological innovation. And they'll just magically somehow carry the day. And I think, those views about, the importance of efficiency or technological innovation in overcoming our crises, I think are fundamentally misguided. One of the points I make in the book is that nature imposes hard limits on efficiency improvements that you can never surpass. It doesn't matter how smart or fancy you get, right? So no car engine can be more efficient than a Carnot engine, right? And Moore's law is broken down recently because of quantum effects and electrons tunneling, so they lose the fidelity of the current, right? Now, people are sort of trying to overcome a lot of those issues. So one way they've done it is they've made bigger computer chips. This is what NVIDIA has done with its recent Blackwell architecture. It's basically 2 GPUs linked together, and it's really fast. It's the world's fastest computer chips. But you can have clever workarounds like that, but at the end of the day, you're never gonna, even those clever workarounds will have their own efficiency limits, right? So there's no way you can overcome every single efficiency limit. Eventually, you're just gonna hit barriers. And we see that in a lot of technologies around the world, right? Like power plants I bring up, they're pretty much stuck at 35, 40% efficiencies. Even combined cycle, sort of gas plants, which are a little bit more efficient, they're hitting barriers too, right? So there's this universal point that no matter how clever or you think you can get, you're always going to hit these natural barriers. And there's going to be a point where you've used so many resources that you can't make any more improvements. So that's sort of one of the arguments that I bring up. And one of the things I want to talk about later is, since I mentioned NVIDIA, I do want to talk about sort of the rise of AI and data centers and how that's fundamentally reshaping sort of the technological and biophysical dynamics of our economy, right? And why it's generally not heading in a good direction. And that's also a notion, a place where the area of spectralization is very important. So those are some of the arguments that I make against. And then I haven't even gotten, Blair, to some of the core assumptions of neoclassical theory, right? So the methodological individualism, the subjective theory of value, right? So these are things that I attack in chapter 2. I didn't address them right now with you, right? So there's a lot of bigger issues about, thinking of human beings as, rational agents that are completely autonomous, and all of our actions in the marketplace reflect our own individual desires, right? As if we're not social creatures and other people have no influence over us and tell us what to do, right? As if you go to work and be like, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I want today. Sometimes I often joke, so I buy ice cream for my wife at the store. Sometimes I like the ice cream that she wants, and sometimes I just buy it because she tells me to, right? It's not because I'm revealing my individual preference. It's because I'm a human being and I just want to make other people happy. So anyway, so we could talk a lot about that, and I criticize Blair in the book. The production theories of neoclassical economics. I criticize time value and the theory of time preference. So I criticize those. Just a lot of the explanations that have been used by neoclassical theories to argue that profits should just be automatically positive. Capitalists deserve their profits because, enter your favorite reason here, because capital is productive, because of time preference, because of this or that, right? And so I attack all of those ideas. I think, comprehensively in the book. And if there's one in particular you want to focus on, happy to do that.
One thing that I really like is how you go after the ideology that is really blocking our attempts to deal with the ecological crisis in any kind of rational way. And one of these is of course the economics, neoclassical economics. The other is like the faith in technology. When I'm talking to my students, the students all believe in technology because they have cell phones in their pockets. And so they suddenly think that technology can do everything, but they confuse information and with the laws of physics, and there's all sorts of problems. And in neoclassical economics, there's this notion that the market is the most efficient, is really the measure of efficiency, or the fountainhead of efficiency. And so an efficient market creates efficient technology, and that solves all problems. But I was interested here in how you go after some of the recipients of the so-called Nobel Prize in economics, because that's really where the ideology is. And of course, the Nobel Prize in economics isn't a real Nobel Prize because it was created 8 years later by the Bank of Sweden and is controlled by the ideological right. And it's totally different from the rest of the Nobel Prizes. It's really a memorial prize for Alfred Nobel, and it's at any rate it's become kind of a ideological barricade. And one of you mentioned Robert Solow, who got the so-called Nobel Prize in economics, or the Swedish Bank Prize. And one of his core views in his growth analysis is that anything in the environment, as you said, can be substituted for. So there can't be any critical ecological limits. You mentioned William Nordhaus's so-called Nobel Prize, which was really given to him. It was presented as well, here is an economist who deals with climate change, but really it was for his downplaying of climate change. He said if we had a 6-degree increase in global average temperature, the economy would decline by 1%. And the scientists who responded to him said, well, we would all be dead. And he said, well, you don't know anything about economics. And they replied, you don't know anything about life. So I always liked that. But there's a third set of Nobel, so-called Nobel recipients that you deal with in your book before they got the Nobel Prize, and that's the so-called institutional thinkers like Darren Esemoglu and Simon Johnson and James A. Robinson, and you criticize them. They say that economic growth is really the product of inclusive institutions, and they define inclusiveness by private property with low rates of expropriation. But it's interesting that they got the Nobel Prize, or so-called Nobel Prize, mainly for their argument on the colonial origins of comparative development, and it was a prize given for a defense of settler colonialism, and so they argue that the inclusive institutions coming out of England and Europe were spread to colonies where the English and other colonials could settle easily, and that was in those countries where there was a low mortality rate for settlers, and they use as their numbers are taken from soldier mortality, not from settler mortality. Anyway, they argue that the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were created inclusive institutions and of private property, and so they were able to develop while other colonies weren't. But it's really a Nobel Prize for genocide, since they leave out the fact that all the extermination that went into the creation of these countries, and their notion of they attribute it to private property rather than the realities of capitalism. I wanted to bring this up, and because it's deeply connected to your book, the ideology is so thick that we're told that the answer is the market, it's private property. The answer is technology, which by creative destruction, comes from private property, which Schumpeter used. Originally, he used it to attack the notion that monopolies would ever be powerful. And
Schumpeter
all of this ideology is making it impossible for us to deal with this ecological crisis, and as you say, the apocalyptic threats that are facing us. So your book is wonderful in going directly at this ideology and revealing what for what it is, on the basis of a more scientific view than neoclassical economics can ever pretend to.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Schumpeter, because Schumpeter actually admits to borrowing the idea of creative destruction from the Communist Manifesto, right, from Marx and Engels, where they talk about the commercial crises and the periodic destructions of capitalism, right? How in every new wave, the old industries have to be destroyed to make way for the new. And so yeah, so it's fascinating how that idea was there. But yeah, so I did want to address the institutional school. I also addressed the cultural school. We can spend time on it if you want. But I think there are a lot of fundamental problems with this school. You mentioned some of them. There are even, I think, deeper problems. One of them is they never explain how inclusive institutions come about. They're just kind of theoretical danglers. They're just magically there, right? It's a, what do I call it, a deus ex machina in the book. They're never actually explained how they get there. It's just their theory takes over after institutional formation has occurred, but we're never told how it's occurred, right? And so one of the examples, I give many examples of this in the book, criticizing their stance, but I bring up the Magna Carta, right? And they say that, the English barons found this the courage to stand up to King John, and then King John signed the Magna Carta, right? The only reason why King John signed it is because he was an idiot, and he lost a massive war in the previous year in 1214 to the French when his allies got wiped out at the Battle of Bouvines. So he lost this war. The French conquered Normandy. This was the tail end of a 10-year war in which the English had committed every military blunder in the book. He'd wasted and squandered all of their time and money of the aristocracy. So they were really angry. by the time it was all said and done, and they basically forced him to give over control over the English economy, right? So that's the kind of history that they ignore. You know, I bring up Venice in the book. Again, when they analyze Venice, they just talk about the internal institutional dynamics of Venice. You know, oh, once they changed how the Doge could be elected, that's when everything went down for Venice, which is not actually true. Venice got even more powerful after that. Its empire continued for at least another couple of centuries. What really did Venice in is, you know, geopolitical considerations, a lot of ruinous wars against the Ottoman Empire. That's how it lost most of its colonial territories in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as I point out in the book, you know, imperial dynamics are fundamentally tied to institutional dynamics, right? When empires become large and powerful, institutions become very secluded and rigid, right? And the ruling classes, that's when they're at their apex. So, which they say nothing about, right? And I say, I have a number of other criticisms against the view, right? The view that I favor, as I write in the book, is I'm not an environmental determinist, right? So I don't believe that the environment determines every single aspect of culture. Right? The environment doesn't determine why you have to pay certain tax rates on your taxes, right? Or why you have to file them, you know, in April every year. So there's a lot of, you know, high-level emergent phenomena about human society, and I'm totally fine with that. But at the end of the day, the broader parameters of human society are indeed constrained by the natural world, and that includes a lot of sometimes includes the radical changes in institutional dynamics, right? So I talk about the rise of England and industrialization in the book in chapter 9. And part of that is the Black Death, right? England had an enormously high death toll from the Black Death. It caused a massive labor scarcity, caused this huge push for labor-saving technologies. And that was one of the, you know, major, you know, structural reasons for why why Europe started on a path that ultimately led to industrialization. And it didn't happen from earlier calamities, because you might say, well, we've always had plagues. We've had the plague of Justinian in the 6th century. We've had the Cyprian plague in the 3rd. We had the Antonine plague in the 2nd. Athens got wrecked by a plague at the start of the Peloponnesian War. Why didn't those lead to, you know, eventually something that became an industrial revolution? Well, simply put, because none of them were nearly as deadly as the Black Death, right? None of them nearly had the kind of impact that the Black Death did. So, so these are the kinds of things that I point out, is that the broader structural parameters of human society are in many ways utterly dependent on the natural world, even, of course, at the same time, we do have autonomy, right? There are a lot of high-level emergent phenomena. So anyway, that's one way I criticize them.
Okay, so here's a question for you, Erald, or something that we can discuss related to these issues. One of my great disappointments in life was discovering the field of economics, or ecological economics, and then learning slowly that, as I saw it, it had gone completely astray or been co-opted. So kind of the history of it is in the mid to late 90s, there was growing awareness of all our ecological problems, and there was a movement to merge or have economics engage with ecology. And what quickly happened is that, as I see it, the movement was co-opted by neoclassical economists who basically said, well, the solution is to bring everything into the market. So we'll put a price on everything. And there's now a huge subdiscipline of economics devoted to just putting prices on ecosystem services, and they're imaginary prices that no one will ever pay. And what I think is important about your book, number one, it criticizes that, but it takes a step back and looks at kind of the whole structure of capitalism and how silly this, I think, ecological economics has become, or that part of it. It's just really just more capitalism. The solution to everything is more capitalism. So, and you're taking what I would call a biophysical approach, but again, different one, and one that I like, because so many biophysical economists have said, well, look, we'll explain GDP we'll use energy and we'll explain GDP. And you're taking very different approach and saying, no, well, GDP is actually very silly. We don't need to explain it. And we've co-written some articles about this. So, so it's a kind of a whole new arena where we're looking at the environmental picture, but we're not saying that the market can solve everything. We're being very critical of capitalism. So what are your thoughts on this kind of whole debacle of ecological economics?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned GDP at the end. So obviously, I spent chapter one, criticizing the notion that GDP can be an accurate barometer of aggregate scale. And I'll just share one story, and anyone who wants to can read the details. But in 2014, Nigeria instantly doubled its GDP because it switched the base years that it used to do the inflation adjustment. Right. So from 1990 to 2010, Nigeria's economy suddenly doubled. Nothing changed overnight in the lives of actual Nigerians, right? It's not like the population doubled. It's not like they had twice as much stuff overnight, twice as many buildings. It's just, they just switched the statistical parameter and the GDP, the real GDP doubled just like that, right? And so, yes, this is one of the main points I make in the book, that we shouldn't be trying to explain financial aggregates from a biophysical perspective, because the financial aggregates are not telling us, mainly anyway, something about the biophysical world. They're telling us something about the class power dynamics of capitalism, right? So people who have power set the prices and the wages and the parameters of the nominal domain that they want. And when you're trying to measure those aggregates, that is ultimately what you're capturing, right? Is what the decisions that powerful people have made in the economy. So even things like consumer spending, right? How much money do corporations waste trying to convince us to buy useless things we don't need, right? How many barriers to entry do they erect for competitors, right? And look at the monopolization of the American economy. How many politicians do they bribe and lobby so that they can maintain their market dominance, right? So the proper way so financial aggregates cannot tell you anything about biophysical scale, right? Finance is telling you something about the class relations and the class struggles of society. That's another thread we can explore later. But returning to the other part of your question, yeah, it's interesting. People like Robert Constanza, what they would say is that, hey, by putting a financial value in all these ecosystem services, we're encouraging the protection of nature, right? We're saying, it should be protected. But another thing you're doing is you're commodifying nature. And you're commodifying it on capitalist terms, right? So this is one of the debates over the social cost of carbon. If you value carbon, the social cost of carbon at very low rates, as most places who have like carbon taxes do, then it won't matter. Who cares? Capitalists can pay all the carbon taxes they want, right? Or in many places, some industries are utterly exempted, right? From industries that are below a certain scale, for example, are entirely exempted from carbon taxes. In some cases, still, like in California, they will pay. They don't have a carbon tax. They have like a sort of a cap and trade system, but the government will pay some the credits for some companies, right? So they'll just make it easy for them so that the companies don't actually have to pay them, right? And so it licenses these kinds of silly ideas, the notion that market incentives can do the job. And market incentives, like carbon taxes, like cap and trade, they have some causal effect. So they're not entirely useless, right? But they're not really the dominant effect. I mean, take Sweden, right? Sweden was the second country in the world after Finland to impose carbon taxes. And in 1990, and in the following decade, energy use and greenhouse gas emissions spiked in Sweden. And then from 2000 on, they've been, officially declining, but I think there are a lot of problems with those numbers that we can get into later. But so, however, the carbon taxes were not the only cause, right? There were a bunch of other policies that the Swedish pursued, which also helped them drag down, greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of confounding variables you have to account for. The other thing you have to account for is greenhouse gas emissions from Sweden had been declining from the late 70s to about 1990, right? Because a lot of European economies, after the oil crisis in the 1970s, they made a lot of big changes to try and be more energy efficient, right? So same thing with California, right? California again, holds itself up as something when it comes to, doing something about greenhouse gases. But even if you believe the prima facie numbers about greenhouse gas emissions coming down, which I don't, I think this is a whole other separate discussions we could have about the flawed statistics when it comes to measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot that I could say there. So I don't believe the numbers, but even if you believe them, right? I mean, they predominantly haven't been caused by, carbon credits and things like that. They've predominantly been caused by other factors, right? California has a bunch of other policies to encourage renewable energy use. There's a lot of wealthier individuals in some of the major cities. They can afford, electric vehicles and things like that. So there's all these confounding variables, which are more relevant than these market incentives. So to get back to your question, I think, yes, this line of thinking of this financial valuation of nature, it tends to result in sort of the commodification of nature, right, and bringing it under the logic of capitalism, and making it so that, well, if you just pay for this, you can continue burning all the fossil fuels in the world if you'll just pay a tax, or if the government will just pay a tax for you, because God forbid we bother our corrupt capitalists in any significant way. So the government will just pay the tax for you, or the government will just do something for you, or you get a slap on the wrist. That's the incentive. These things don't really have much of an impact, right? And so I think that's the kind of dangerous policy recommendations that this kind of viewpoint can lead to.
I wanted to add something about what Blair said about Costanza and what happened. There was actually a coup within ecological economics in the journal Ecological Economics when Costanza became editor, and there was a battle within it, and they threw Howard Odum, who was working on a form of ecological accounting based on energy, and all of the natural scientists associated with him were thrown out of the journal of Ecological Economics. They were opposing Costanza's approach of putting a price on everything in nature and seeing that as the solution. So this didn't just happen by happen chance. It was a coordinated action. And Costanza's approach, like you say, it's he said, well, we need to have a price on everything in nature, and ecosystem services, so that we can protect it. But actually, it opened the road to the financialization of nature, which is very, very a big process now, where they're finding ways to commodify nature using this analysis. So this is dangerous. I was thinking, though, of your analysis of veilerism. That fascinates me, Erald, and the notion of veilerism is combining the stability and regeneration, and a kind of aiming at a dynamic equilibrium, and how you develop that instead of adopting the terminology of degrowth, you use this concept of veilerism, and of course the most impressive use of that was your emphasis on what we used to call contraction and convergence, but finding upper energy limits for society, and basically you pinpointed that there's really an equilibrium in energy use, in long-term energy uses, which is around where Italy and Spain are today, and in terms of per capita energy use. And I use this in my classes. I used it in last week in my environmental sociology class. I said, look, going back to the level of per capita energy use, or the United States shifting to the per capita energy use of Italy, is not going back to this Stone Age. It doesn't mean imposition of poverty or the end of civilization or anything like that. It actually points to a more rational approach to using resources. And really, the point is, and you make it over and over again, that we're always told that technology is the solution. Why? Because this system doesn't want change in social relations. It doesn't want changes in social organization. Capitalism is sacrosanct, so that we're told technology is the only solution. But we know, and all the science tells us, that technology in itself is not capable of dealing with the kinds of pressures that capitalism is imposing and where it's taking us with respect to the environment, and that the only way we can really make fundamental change, and we can do it quickly, is through changes in social organization, which also means using technology, but using technology in more rational ways that are more democratic, more equitable, and really more efficient. So it's this argument that you end with in your analysis that really is most impressive to me, and I wanted to see if you have any comments on that. But everybody should know about this notion of veilerism. Whether we use that term or not, it is a way of getting past some of the traps we're in.
Yeah, and thank you for that, John. And I tend to pronounce it veilerism because its root word is valence. Think about high school chemistry when you learned about valence electrons, in the outer shells.
I think of value, so so that has a short A.
Yeah, so veilerism, veilerist, yes, it's a new worldview, essentially the new economic system that I propose for organizing, human society. So why don't we pause on that for a moment, John, and let me address something you immediately said towards the end, and that is sort of technological change under capitalism and why it doesn't, why that's not the answer to the problems that we have. So I think this is, in a deep theoretical sense, probably the most important part of the book. And so let me say a little bit about that, about the technological dynamics under capitalism and what is changing under veilerism, right? Because the whole point is veilerism is a response to what we have now, and it's a new worldview that it's supposed to compensate for some of the problems we have now. So let me talk about that in a bit of a greater detail. So the first thing I want to mention is that, the phrase technological innovation is highly ambiguous, right? Nobody even, different people mean different things by it. So in the academic literature, it's been defined as everything from patents per capita to R&D funding to, total factor productivity in the neoclassical theory of growth. And I'll take each of those in turn. What's the problem with thinking of technological innovations as just patents? Well, one problem is with all these notions is it's hard to make inferences and policy recommendations about what actually needs to change in our economies so that we can make them sustainable with a broader biosphere, right? That's a problem that's common to all of them. Another problem with patents specifically, though, is that if anyone knows anything about the USPTO, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, you know that a huge fraction of the patents they give out are for completely ridiculous things. They've given patents out for a beer umbrella. That's literally an umbrella that you put on your beer in the summer so you can keep it cool. That's actually a patent that's out there. They've given a patent for a scent that supposedly cures male impotence. That's right. They've given a patent for a urinal headrest. So the idea is, you rest your head when you go to the urinal. These are all things that have been actually given a patent for. In the 2010s, it was common for half of all software patents to be found invalid in court because they're just nonsensical, common things that everyone does. And somebody said, well, I want a patent on it, right? Some studies have shown that 30% of all patents would be found invalid if they were taken to court, right? So patents are not a good way to think about technological innovation because a lot of what's given a patent is just completely ridiculous stuff, right? And that has to do with wider institutional problems and wider problems in the economic system. The USPTO, for example, gets a lot of its money from application fees that incentivizes it to approve a lot of ridiculous patents so it can keep getting more fees. I'm not going to get into that. It's not really relevant for the book. R&D funding, again, R&D funding, companies play around with the meaning of R&D funding all the time, right? There's been pharmaceutical companies that have used legal fees as part of their R&D funding totals. So you'll find a lot of ridiculous things like that. A lot of funding is going towards things that have no relation to technological innovation whatsoever. And that's actually a big problem with many major corporations. So I don't look at that. Total factor productivity, again, this is one of those things in neoclassical aggregate production functions. They're completely useless because, like I said, they're just identity equations. They don't actually tell you anything about production. They're inherently meaningless under the conditions which they're usually tested. So I get rid of a lot of these notions of technological innovation. So what am I interested in, right? So again, what is the theme of the book, right? Energy and biophysical dynamics and how we can use those to understand the economy. So what I'm really going for in the book is I look at energy conversion, right? I look at this concept and I delve into it very deeply. And in chapter 5, I talk about something called the conversional network, right? So what do I mean here? Well, I'm looking at conversional devices. What's a conversional device? It's your car engine, right? It converts the fuel, the chemical energy of the fuel into the mechanical energy of the tires. My computer right here is a conversional device. It's converting electricity into controlled radiation, and that's how I'm able to see all of you, right? A power plant is a conversional device. The brain is a conversional. It's not a technological system, but it's conversional in some sense, right? It takes in light, converts it into neurochemical signals, right? So I'm interested in conversional devices and the conversional network, right? So I view these conversional devices as being in a network where they send energy signals to each other. And so I study this network. And the reason why I do that is because if you want to understand what is happening to the energy dynamics of the economy, how big at a biophysical scale an economy is getting, or whether it's collapsing or contracting or expanding, the best way to do that is to understand what's happening to conversional devices, right? Because ultimately, they are the ones that are taking an energy input and producing an output for some specific purpose, right? So ultimately, the entire techno-social structure of civilization is based on our conversional devices. The reason why we have highways and railways is because we have cars and trains, right? Highways and railways by themselves don't convert any energy, but they facilitate the conversion of energy from cars and trains. So I look at conversional devices because these are really the key to understanding the energy dynamics of modern economies, right? Of all economies, but especially of modern economies. Okay, and one of the notions that I introduce as part of that is this notion of spectralization, right? And I'll explain why I called it that. But a spectralization is any change in conversional methods of conversional technologies that has an effect, a notable effect on efficiency or on the power consumption or the power output of a device, right? Let me explain that a little bit because this is an important concept. Okay, so like I said, spectralization is a change in conversional methods. So an example of that would be electric vehicles, right? The change from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. That's a spectralization, right? In that particular case, you're changing the fuel input source. Another example of spectralization is James Watt adding a condenser to his engine to make it more efficient. That had an impact on the efficiency of the device, right? So there's lots of different examples of spectralizations. Now, not all technological change can be a spectralization, or not all changes are spectralization. So if a car maker puts leather seats on a car, that may have financial value for the car maker because now he can sell the car for more, and it has an impact on you as a consumer because now the car costs more, but it's not a spectralization. It's not a change to the conversional technology in the car, right? And what is that? That's the engine fundamentally, right? Because the engine is doing the hard work, although there's other conversional components as well. So, excuse me, let me just drink some water. So the point that I want to emphasize is that not all changes to technology are spectralizations, right? Spectralizations are specifically conversional changes in the conversional methods to conversional technologies, okay? Now, why is this important? The reason why it's important is because in capitalism, we have a regime of what I call catalytic spectralization, which is that changes in conversional methods to one technology, especially the technology diffuses more broadly throughout the economy, then induce a bunch of changes, more spectralizations to other technologies. And this is where I wanted to bring up the rise of AI, right? Because I think this is sort of one of the critical points that emerges from this whole discussion. So if you look at the rise of the large language models and everything we've seen over the past few years, they're fundamentally dependent on these AI GPUs, right? Graphics processing units, largely produced by NVIDIA. Others do them as well, but NVIDIA is the de facto monopolist in the market. And what has happened as GPUs have proliferated is that the entire ecosystem of data center technologies has changed, right? So as NVIDIA, for example, has gone from Hopper to Blackwell, a bunch of companies like Micron are now designing more powerful memory chips so that the GPU can run faster, right? Because the on-chip memory that they used to rely on isn't enough. So now there's like dedicated memory chips that have to be updated so they can work with NVIDIA's chips. Oh, and by the way, now that you have such a faster rate of data transmission throughout the data center, you also need to update your network switches. So network switches are these dark rectangular boxes that have a lot of cables going in and out of them. So you have to update those because now you need to just process a lot more data across the data center. Oh, and by the way, Blackwell, because it's now more powerful, so Blackwell is NVIDIA's latest generation AI chip, it's more powerful than the Hopper. You know, Hopper consumed about 700 watts. A typical Blackwell does about 1,200 watts. Because it's much more powerful, it's more likely to overheat, right? So a lot of electrical components, they overheat. That's in physics, that's known as Joule heating. So when electrons pass through a conductor, they interact with the atoms in the lattice, they transfer some of their energy to the atoms, and the entire atomic lattice, in effect, shakes. That's heating, right? That's the source of the heating in data centers. It's called Joule heating. So Blackwell, because it's more powerful, generates a lot of heat. So now you need more powerful cooling systems, right? So now you need, a few years ago, you know, a lot of data centers, they relied on air-powered cooling. You just have these giant fans. Now they're going more towards water-powered cooling, right? So now you have these pipes extending throughout the data center into the server racks or next to the server racks, you know, absorbing that heat, right? And it's very energy intensive. It's very water intensive. It's often an unappreciated fact about data centers. We know they're going to lead to a lot more electricity consumption, but they're also going to lead to more water intensive consumption. That's another one of their dangers. So now you have to update the cooling systems. And then, and as I just said, you know, you're building these, you know, a lot of companies now are starting to build these mega clusters, these massive data centers. You know, Meta is planning one in Louisiana worth $10 billion, powered by 3 natural gas plants, 2 gigawatts of power, enough to supply over 1 million homes, right? So you're now going to this massive scale. You need to generate more and more electricity. That's led to spectralizations in a bunch of other devices. Some people are now trying to push small modular nuclear reactors. Hard to say how effective that's been. There's really no major commercial use cases yet. Other people are going to aeroderivative gas turbines. This is what Vernova's doing, right? Aeroderivative because the gas turbines are derived from jet engines, right? The design is derived from a jet engine. So the point is that the diffusion of this AI chip is the catalyst that is causing all of these spectralizations in other economic sectors, right? And it is, in effect, changing the whole technosocial structure of civilization because the ruling classes, you know, they see AI as the ultimate superpower, right? They think this is going to guarantee their total domination over labor forever, right? And that's why they're putting so much capex into it, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. But the thing is, when you bring in all of these new technologies, it's not like the old ones go away. It's not like NVIDIA brought in Blackwell, which, you know, it tells us is somehow more efficient and when NVIDIA says Blackwell is more efficient, what they mean is it can do more calculations per unit energy, right? But that doesn't mean that it's going to lead to energy savings because what happens, as is well known in ecological science, the Jevons paradox, and Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, actually brought this up himself, is you know, when you make a process more efficient, that makes it cheaper, leads to more demand, leads to economies of scale. People tend to consume more of it, right? So, you know, just because Blackwell came along and you know, calculation efficiency is better, that doesn't mean energy use is going to go down. Energy use is going to go up. because now a lot of these hyperscalers, they're just going to use their chips to do more, right? And even that's true even with the advances in DeepSeek, which are not going to fundamentally change anything. They're still going to consume a lot of these AI chips. But the other point I was making is, just because Blackwell has come onto the scene doesn't mean Hopper went away. Hopper was the first generation of the AI chips, right? They're still there. They're more inefficient, right? And so something that's interesting about the nature of conversional technologies, and this is true for all of them. It's not just about capitalism. It's true about all historical eras. If you look at the nature of all historical technologies, and if you look at the efficiency progress they follow, they go on a sigmoid efficiency curve. So they start off as very inefficient right here. Then their efficiency improves over time. Then they plateau, right? And they can plateau for many reasons. Again, natural physical limits, or maybe people just lose interest. They want to develop other products. They don't really care about this anymore. So they switch interest and the technology kind of just plateaus. And what tends to happen is under capitalism, under this regime of catalytic spectralization, is you're flooding the economy with a bunch of energy intensive, inefficient devices. And because they're new, because the spectralization is again a change, a new conversional technology, because it's new, it's necessarily starting off low on the efficiency curve. So you're flooding the economy with these energy intensive, inefficient devices. That tends to expand the aggregate scale of the economy because you're not doing any corresponding downscaling anywhere else, right? It's not like you brought on Blackwell and you got rid of Hopper. Hopper's still running in a bunch of data centers. So what tends to happen is, because of this, is multiple things follow, right? The aggregate energy scale of the economy expands. This is one thing that happens under capitalism. The aggregate efficiency of capitalist economies remains very low, even if it improves, right? Even if for older generations of technologies you can get improvements. Nevertheless, because you're constantly flooding the economy with these new technologies, and they're diffusing and they're very inefficient, the aggregate efficiency of the system kind of stalls. So these are some new observations. I think these are new contributions that I make for understanding sort of the technological dynamics of capitalism. And I'll pause right there because I know I've said a lot and there may be a lot of questions. So let me just get your take on that.
Well, there's Richard Haas, who's formerly head of the Council on Economic Advisors and a leading figure within the establishment, has just written an article saying the energy transition is over. And this is actually you see a situation where the banks are pulling out of the energy transition programs associated with climate change. The big 5 U.S. banks have pulled out of that. And the way they explain all of this is that AI has created this huge new demand for energy, just increasing astronomically. And this is actually the basis for Trump's declaration of an energy emergency, although it may seem weird, and the argument that we have to go back to fossil fuels and forget about the solar and wind and so on, because they need to rev this system up fast, and they see that as the way of doing it. But we can see what you're talking about is going on, and the economic system is responding in its usual irrational way. They're planning on more intensified energy use than ever before, and the ecological effects are astronomical, even if you leave out the effects on climate change. So I think that what you're talking about is very important, and this notion that they're actually the energy transition is now over is very important in this context. And the entire explanation for it is AI.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that a little bit, John, because I think there's an interesting dimension we could take it here, and I want to talk a little bit about China, right, which actually is in many ways successfully carrying out a massive energy transition, and I think will do so even if they go full blown into AI the way the United States has. So in China, they've made huge investments into renewable energy. As you know, I think the country is basically about 5 or 6 years away from all new cars being sold, being electric vehicles. They're actually not, they could be about 10 or 11 years away as well, but they're pretty close. Certainly much closer than us, right? So you've had this huge proliferation in electric vehicles. China produces, 75% of the world's electric vehicles, over 80% of the world's solar panels. So, so China is trying to carry out this transition, but even the Chinese are having a little bit of difficulty. And here the geopolitical tensions come into play, which I talk about in chapter 12. So in 2023, 95% of all the coal plant capacity in the world, the new coal plant capacity, was came from China, right? And so on the one, so you see this tension in China, on the one hand, trying to modernize the economy, trying to bring in renewables, on the other hand, also wanting domestic and energy security. And so I think, Xi is trying to thread that line, but China is really important here because in many ways, the future of human civilization will be decided by what China does, right? Not by what the United States does. China consumes twice as much energy as the United States, makes a third of all the world's motor vehicles, produces 60% of the world's steel, 55% of the world's aluminum. So China is the world's factory, right? And really, in many ways, the future trajectory of human history will be dependent on what China does. And on the one hand, Xi has talked about wanting to construct an ecological civilization, and he is probably the most left-wing leader since Mao in China. So those are in some sense encouraging. But on the other hand, he has his own pressures from the domestic public, from his own capitalists, and China is still pursuing many dirty sources of energy and still growing its energy use. So we will see where that goes, right? But I think China is absolutely the central player to watch in the next decade or two.
Maybe now is a good time to transition to the later chapters in your book where you delve into the state politics and that sort of thing. And I think it was interesting for me because, of course, nobody knows where we're headed. Humanity is headed, but we all have ideologies about what we think will happen or what we want to happen. And maybe I'll frame a few of them. The most dominant in our society is techno-optimism, which you've already talked about, which is just that's just the dominant view in capitalism, that technology will save or fix all our problems. There's also doomerism, which is maybe a uniquely North American problem. I'm not sure. Or doomerism is just the idea that we're destined for collapse, back to the Stone Age, if not slightly above that. Then a more prominent in Europe movement is the degrowth movement, which I think we should talk about. And degrowth, I think, in some ways is very useful, but in other ways naive, in the sense that it puts a lot of responsibility on individuals. The idea is that we can be happy with lower levels of material consumption, which I think is just empirically true, but it just is naive in the sense that it assumes that we will behave rationally and pursue a goal that is ecologically rational. And what we're seeing right now is just the complete opposite of that, where our leaders, many of them, I won't mention names, just live in fantasy worlds and they're making decisions based on myths. And we're seeing AI, a massive wave of speculation in AI for some benefit, but no immediate benefit. So this is where you have a very different picture about what we should be thinking about for the future, and maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about the last 3 chapters. And veilerism is what I call it. Again, this is the name that I gave this worldview, and it actually came from another book in the monthly review from the monthly review press, where these 2 authors talked about ecological valence of different animals, and where in that sense they meant it as, some animals can live in many different environments. Some are like polar bears are restricted to the North Pole. And so I kind of, I saw that, I reconfigured it to using valence more in the sense of stability, right? And so this is sort of the grand conclusion of the book that, hey, we should switch from a regime of energy growth and biophysical growth to one of stability. And so, and veilerism is supposed to be a combination of the words valence and regeneration, right? So the regeneration of the natural world. And there's sort of a double-sided meaning too, right? So the stability is both for human society, but stability for the natural world itself. And the regeneration is also for the natural world, but also human society itself needs to be regenerated after the, capitalist cataclysm that we'll all have been through. So what are some of the central principles of veilerism? So in chapter 10, I talk about the 4 pillars, right? So the four pillars were stabilization, socialization, modularization, and localization, right? So I'll talk a little bit about them. And these are, you can think of them as kind of design principles for a new kind of society that will be less energy intensive than what we have now, but that will still conserve a lot of the positive features of the modern world. Because look, there have been a lot of great breakthroughs in the modern world, right? Our life expectancy is a lot longer. Literacy rates are a lot higher. So there's a lot of great things that we should conserve about the modern world. I don't want us to go back to being nomads, right? I am okay with preserving industrial civilization, but the question is under what terms and conditions do you want to preserve it, right? And so this is the big question, I think, if you're going to start to theorize in this direction. It's fine to say you want to preserve it, but how should you preserve it? And so I have these kind of design principles in there, and as part of these design principles, I make specific recommendations. So under stabilization, this is the idea, like I said, that we should have managed fluctuations around a dynamic equilibrium. So in the book, I recommend that all societies cap their energy use at 60,000 kilocalories per person per day. And then they could also set lower limits if they want. That's the range part of the dynamic equilibrium. And so the idea is they will kind of stay in that range, but nobody should ever cross 60,000 kilocalories. Like John mentioned, there are many societies that are kind of there already: Britain, Italy, Spain, Portugal, China, right? So this is not asking us to go back to the days of our nomadic days when we were at 4,000 or 5,000 kilocalories per person per day, right? So if I'd wanted us to go back to that, I would have recommended that we eat food all day and do nothing else, right? But clearly, I am okay, and I think the biosphere can tolerate more human economic activity than that. Hence my the recommendations that I make. So that's part of stabilization, having macroenergetic stability. Coupled to that, though, however, is just social and economic stability as well. So I talk about the need to put caps on financial wealth, to have redistribution of wealth. I think that's a very effective way of dealing with the ecological crisis, because one reason why we have so much energy use is all the exploitation that happens under capitalism. So if we just have some wealth redistribution so that the rich, which are using the vast majority of the energy, just don't use that much energy, and we let other people who are poor and struggling use more energy, or middle class use more energy, that can totally be fine, right? So wealth redistribution is one of the things I call for, and so I make a bunch of other arguments and recommendations there in the book. I talk about socialization. So this is bringing economic resources under democratic control. That can mean many things. It can mean nationalization. So I'm a big fan of nationalization for dominant energy intensive industries. This would be things like oil and gas. This would be things like even defense, finance. I would love to nationalize. The 4 biggest banks in the world by assets are all Chinese and all owned by the Chinese government, right? And China's financial system works very well in general and doesn't have the kinds of periodic crises that we do. So I'm a big fan of socialization, bringing more goods and resources under public control. And the reason why that's important for this ecological transition towards to veilerism is having the state have direct levers of control is extremely important if you're going to take quick decisions, right? Rather than letting capitalists decide, well, 50 years from now, it'll be profitable, so that's when I'll do it. The great thing about the state is because you have the central bank, you can monetize away a lot of losses and still carry out some of the transitions that you need, which, again, private capital simply cannot do, right? So socialization is a big part of it. Modularization is another big part. So I'm a big fan of modular manufacturing and modular industrial strategies. I think there's a lot that we can do there to conserve on energy use, to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the design principles I emphasize there is just reusability and interchangeability. Right now, there's this notion, especially in a lot of the circular economy stuff, that, well, we should just recycle a lot of the waste that we should get better at recycling, right? But I think our point should be to reduce the amount of waste we produce in the first place, right? So, back in the day, you remember the milkman, he would bring you the glass milk every day in the morning, and you would reuse that glass milk, right? You didn't have to toss anything away. Now that's just a silly example, but in a more modern context, you can imagine using, a lot of people use egg cartons for like seedlings, because egg cartons are biodegradable, so you can put them in the ground and grow seeds that way. In a more serious sense, for industrial manufacturing, if you have more modular production, you can imagine a robotic arm breaking down. Well, if a certain component is broken, you don't have to replace the entire arm. You can just take that component out and put in the component that's broken, right? So you save a lot on energy use, save a lot on greenhouse gas emissions and pollution and trash. And so it's a very effective strategy. Now, this modularization strategy can be expensive upfront, just in terms of finances. So this is where the state would need to come in and take the role, right? Because if you're going to talk about these big energy initiatives, the state has to take the lead. Capitalists are not going to do it because they're going to lose money, and they don't want to do anything where they lose money. So modularization is essentially my answer to catalytic spectralization under capitalism, right? Having a modular economy with reusable and interchangeable parts. We do not need 10,000 different types of tables and chairs. We can just have like 100 or 150 different types of tables and chairs, each with modular components. So when your kid scribbles down something on the chair or messes up your sofa, you don't have to buy a whole new sofa. You can just take that component and replace it. So you generate a lot less waste that way, right? So I think modularization is a big part of industrial strategy under veilerism. Finally, localization. A lot of waste, pollution, trash, emissions are generated from international trade. Things are produced in one place and then they're shipped in a million different places in the global value chains of capitalism. In the old days, you would send the raw materials to a factory and everything would get produced in that factory and the finished product would come out, right? Now what happens is, you take your raw materials from China, you send them to Mexico, Mexico does something, then you send them to the United States does something, then you send them to a factory in Britain, and something happens over there, then you send them to Japan, and that's where the car is made. So there's so many different, of these value chains floating around, highly energy intensive, right? So I'm in favor of more localized production and trade. That doesn't mean I think international trade should go away. I just think there's a lot of opportunities for building domestic industries, for smart industrial strategy, for smart industrial policies. And it's good economics too, right? If you want people to actually buy into this vision, then we should have a powerful domestic manufacturing industry. So people are actually making things. So we're more immune to supply chain crises. Like when the COVID pandemic hit, the United States had difficulty making gloves and masks. It was really embarrassing, right? We had to buy that stuff from China at first, and then eventually our production capacity ramped up, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for improvement there, right? Where you just localize production more, and it's good, for the biosphere.
Okay, I mean, you were on a roll, and wow, this conversation has flowed very smoothly with a million wonderful illustrative examples. I feel like people who are new to these subjects will also be able to access this. So thank you very much for the way you're breaking things down for the general public as well. We're coming close to time, and I just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to make any closing remarks.
Hey, Erald, it's a bit prescient. Maybe you close by talking about the politics of the state which oddly is missing from so much of the ecological literature. It's quite bizarre, really. And I hope that changes broadly, but it definitely changes in your book. And that's one of the things that I enjoyed at the end is that you talk about the ways of organizing the nation state and also internationally, right? Because we have this currently with this prisoner's dilemma where maybe a group of countries try to reduce their energy use, but there can always be some third country that just says to hell with you, and they can go their own way and reap the benefits. And this is this happens throughout humanity or throughout human history, and we're not immune to it in the current situation. So I appreciate that. I think it's prescient. I hope we have more social scientists dealing with this sort of long-term political issue.
Related to that too, I mean, one of the things that you bring up at the end of your book in relation to the state is the conflict between oligarchy and democracy, and oligarchy, of course, being not simply ruled by the few, but ruled by the rich, as it's classically been understood, and democracy classically understood as rule by the poor. And you bring this out, and you see your ecological vision and in the veilerist state in terms of an enhancement of democratic possibilities. So you're not talking about just centralized state solutions as some people think of it, although the state is involved. You're talking about a society where you're going in the direction of substantive equality as well as ecological sustainability. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Thank you, Blair and John. And to follow up on that note, I'll end with an example from the book, right? So I talk about Tokugawa Japan in the book, and how in the 16th and the 17th century, Japan had a major deforestation crisis, right? So that they basically felled, the vast majority of their trees because of war, because of a lot of construction and an economic boom. And they realized they were having major problems with soil quality and landslides and other things. And what Japan did was it implemented a series. It couldn't do substitution in the way the neoclassicals thought at the time, right? Because it didn't have coal like England did. Like England had vast and easily accessible coal deposits. So when they had their own deforestation crises, they could switch to burning coal, and that launched the Industrial Revolution. Japan didn't have that, at least in the main islands. So what they did is they implemented a bunch of political and social reforms to conserve on timber use and to conserve on resource consumption. And what happened over the following century and a half in Japan is that the population stabilized. It went down just a little bit, but mostly it was stable. Energy use stabilized, and Japan's forests regrew, right? So Japan survived what would otherwise have been a calamitous ecological collapse, right? And the authorities knew it. And the way they did it is through a combination of both top-down control, but also local forms of ecological management. And this is the final theme that I reach in the book with the veilerist cosmopole, where I argue we need global forms of governance for managing the ecological commons, because we can't just solve this problem and then have another one like it arise 2 centuries from now, right? So humanity needs some kind of global ecological management. At the same time, we also need local forms of control to ensure that people are doing the right thing, and to transmit information more accurately, right? So these two things don't have to stand in opposition to each other. I think that's how the relationship is often portrayed. I think Tokugawa Japan shows that you can have smart policies from the central government, putting quotas on the amount of wood you can take and other things you can do in farming, and you can have smart policies from our local councils. And then these two together can really produce a major ecological transition that in Japan's case, I think this is one of the most famous cases in the history of ecology. I mean, it saved an entire society, right? Otherwise, Japan would have been a goner, and you wouldn't hear much about it today. But they really saved themselves by looking seriously at their problems and taking some drastic actions. And Japanese civilization survived as a result. And I think that is one of the most inspiring cases that we can take to heart as global civilization today, about what we can do to make sure that we have a prosperous millennium instead of a disastrous one.
That's a somewhat hopeful note to end on. Prosperous, as in we will survive. Maybe the capitalists will have one endless profits after the apocalypse in hell. But meanwhile, since we don't believe in hell and there's only heaven and hell here on Earth, let's hope that you're right, Erald, and they don't win out. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. This was really truly elucidating conversation. We encourage you to circulate it widely, given that it is both rich with many illustrative historical examples that are useful for students, and also will be useful to those who are already, steeped in the subject matter all the way. And of course, if you haven't gotten your copy yet, this is what it looks like. And you can also go on our website and order it directly from the website. So thank you for joining us, Blair. Thank you for joining us, of course, John, and I'll see you later. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.